Hey guys, thank you so much for listening. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and enjoy the video. This story takes place when I was 18 years old. I had just gotten to my dorm, setting the large box down on the floor before starting to unpack. It was my freshman year of college, and I had just hugged my mom and dad goodbye before starting to empty the large box full of my things. I was putting a pair of shoes under my bed when my roommate walked through the door. I could immediately tell there was something off about him, just from the way he looked, and from his smell. He smelled like he had been swimming in a pool full of gasoline, and he licked his lips repeatedly as his eyes rested upon me. His hair was long and greasy, and he wore an oversized black hoodie. I stood up from the floor and put my hand out in front of me. I introduced myself, telling him my name was Liam, and it was nice to meet him. His tongue continued to flick between his lips as he looked down at my hand. There was an awkward pause as he just stared at my hand for a few seconds before bringing his own hand out from the pocket of his hoodie and shaking mine. He sat on the bed across from mine and watched me as I continued to unpack. I tried talking to him about everyday things, like asking him if he was excited for the upcoming semester, but he would only answer with a yes or a no to all of my questions. Eventually, I gave up with the small talk and laid down on my bed with my laptop, and he did the same. This guy was definitely weird, but he seemed essentially harmless. I soon learned, though, that I was wrong about that. The following weeks, I met more and more kids that lived on the same floor as me and made some friends in my classes. I came home to my dorm one night to find Eli laying on his stomach on his bed, watching a movie on his laptop. I said hi to him, and he didn't say anything back, which didn't really surprise me at this point. It was pretty late, so I threw my backpack on the ground and climbed into my bed, shutting off my lamp as I did so. I was asleep within a few minutes. I must have been out for a few hours before waking up to the sound of a bed creaking. I opened my eyes and saw Eli sitting cross-legged on his bed across from me, still licking his lips as his wide eyes stared at me. I sat up in bed and asked him if everything was all right and if he needed anything. He just shook his head, not saying a word before laying down on his bed. I rolled over to my side, facing away from him. I couldn't fall asleep after that weirdness, so I just laid there until my alarm went off an hour later. The next day, I had come back to my dorm after my morning class, only to see that Eli was gone, which was weird because up until that point, he had always been in the dorm whenever I was there, as if he never left. My afternoon class had been canceled that day, so I decided to text my friend Seth, who lived down the hall from me, and see if he wanted to walk down to the pizza shop and grab something to eat. He said yeah, and we headed out across campus. As we were walking, we saw a group of people all standing around staring at something. We walked over, and I saw what they were looking at. Eli was laying on the grass next to a life-size blow-up doll, kissing it as if it were a real person. Lots of people were laughing, and some of them had their phones out recording it. It was definitely the weirdest thing I had ever seen, but I also felt bad for Eli at the same time. Me and Seth started walking again, and he asked, "Isn't that your roommate?" I said yeah, and he said he felt sorry for me. We eventually got to the pizza place and made plans to hang out later that day as well. Apparently there was a big party going on that night, and Seth knew the guy hosting it. I wasn't much of a party goer, but I supposed it was a good excuse to not have to be alone with Eli that night. I went to the party and had a pretty good time. I met a few people and exchanged numbers. Things were going really well, until I got home later that night and found Eli sitting on the floor in the middle of our room. I said hi to him and asked what was up. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me as I laid down on my bed and started scrolling through my phone. That's when I noticed something was off. I looked over at Eli and noticed that the shirt he was wearing looked really similar to one I owned. In fact, that was my shirt. I could tell from the little rip by the collar. I asked him why he was wearing my shirt, and he quickly said he wasn't wearing my shirt before walking over to the closet and pulling a hoodie on. I decided not to push the issue any further but I knew he was lying. Why the hell was he wearing my shirt? I just shook my head and decided I would put in a request to be transferred to a new dorm the following day. I went to sleep, only to be woken up in the middle of the night by the sound of rustling coming from the foot of my bed. I turned on my bedside lamp and saw that it was Eli, standing at the end of my bed, with all of my clothes in front of him, as well as my laptop and my phone. He was going through all of my things while I was asleep. I asked him what the hell he was doing, but he just turned and ran straight out the door. I got out of bed and put my things away. The next morning, I put in a request for an immediate dorm transfer, and I was approved. When I got back to my dorm, all of Eli's things were gone. After that, things went back to normal for the next few weeks. That is, until late one night when I was awoken again to a sound coming from the window behind me. I turned around and saw Eli standing outside, holding a knife in his hand and dragging the blade down the window. I grabbed my phone and dialed the campus police. They were there in just a matter of minutes and had Eli in handcuffs. I ran outside and told the officers the situation and everything that had been happening the past month. They put him in the back of their car, and that was the last I ever saw of him. I don't know where he is now or what happened to him. All I know is that if I ever do see him again, it'll be too soon. I was an engineering student in college and didn't have many friends. That was okay with me though, because I was always a bit of a loner and enjoyed keeping to myself for the most part. The guy I shared an apartment with, Dave, was the same way. He was quiet and introverted and never really left his bedroom. That was fine with me though, considering I was pretty much the exact same personality type. Life was good, until around the time Dave started dating this girl Anna. At first I was happy for them. They seemed to get along well, and they both seemed like they really liked each other. That quickly changed though, and after about a month of them dating, they would usually go into his room, close the door, and only a few minutes later I could hear shouting and insults being hurled between them. I had started to nudge Dave toward just breaking up with Anna if things were going that bad and he didn't like her anymore, but he would always just insist that they were only going through a rough patch and things would get better soon. I wanted to believe him, but not long after these reassurances, he and Anna would be back at it again, calling each other names and screaming at each other at the top of their lungs, to the point where the neighbors called the cops once. One day in late October, Dave and Anna were back at it again, screaming and crying in the other room. I was writing a paper on my laptop, listening to music to drown the noise out, when suddenly I could feel the floor shake beneath me. I paused the music and looked up. What the hell could that have been? I moved the laptop off of my lap and took off the headphones I had been wearing, when another vibration raced up through the floor and into my feet. The shouting between Dave and Anna had stopped, and that's when I became worried that the fighting had turned physical. I ran over to Dave's room and pounded on the door, asking him what was going on and if everything was all right in there. There was a pause before I heard Dave shout back that everything was fine and that he had just lost his balance and stumbled onto the floor. I wasn't really buying this, but I wasn't sure what else to do. "Anna?" I asked. "Are you okay?" There was another long pause before I could hear Anna's voice softly come through the door. "Yeah, I'm fine. Everything is okay." I pinched the bridge of my nose and let out a long, frustrated sigh. "All right, I worry about you guys. Please just keep things civil, okay?" There was no response from either of them, so I made my way back to my laptop, this time not listening to music and not putting on my headphones. There were no longer any shouts coming from Dave's bedroom, which was a relief, but for some reason, a bit unnerving at the same time. The next day, I came home from class and went to the kitchen to grab something to eat before hitting the books. As I was standing there, rummaging through the cupboards, there was a knock at the door. I went over to answer it and saw Anna standing in the doorway, her face covered in bruises. "Oh my God," I said before ushering her inside the apartment. She had clearly been crying, and she wrapped her arms around my neck and started crying some more. We just stood like that for a minute while she cried, her arms like a vice around my neck. I got her to sit down on the couch with me while I handed her some tissues. "Dave did this to you?" I asked. She nodded and then started crying some more. I felt a strange mix of anger and revulsion. I was angry at Dave for doing this to her, and at the same time, I was repulsed at myself for not stopping it before it escalated into physical violence. She told me that he had hit her for the first time last night when I felt the floor shake. That was her body collapsing to the floor. She said she tried to grab onto the dresser on her way down, but that just toppled over as well, the second vibration. She told me that Dave threatened to kill her if she screamed for help, or if she told me what had happened when I had knocked at the door to check on them. I just sat there, looking at this poor girl. She was clearly terrified to be telling this to me now, and that just made me feel even worse. I asked her if she had reported this to the police, and she said she hadn't because she was afraid that Dave would find out and would actually kill her if she did. I opened my mouth to tell her that I would go with her when the door opened. Dave was standing there, hands in his jacket pockets. Seeing his face just made my anger intensify, and I shot up from the couch. "What the hell did you do, you piece of shit?" I started to say as I quickly made my way across the room to confront him. I could hear Anna beginning to plead with me not to do this, and I could hear her starting to cry again as Dave pulled the gun from his pocket and aimed it directly at my face. "Sit the fuck down," he said. His eyes were beginning to well up with tears. Not tears of sadness, though. No, tears of fury. This was the face of a man who was angry enough to kill. I stopped my advance and put my hands up in front of me. The anger wasn't gone, not at all, but at that moment a more primitive part of my brain took control and instructed me to do as I was told. I sat back down on the couch next to Anna. "So this is what you do, Anna? You run to your little boyfriend Cody for help? I should have known, you're such a whore. You've probably been sleeping with him behind my back this whole time." "I haven't been sleeping with anyone, Dave, you know that," she yelled back. "Shut up," he said, using the back of his arm to wipe the tears from his eyes. The gun was wobbling up and down in his shaking hand. "How could you do this to me? I loved you, Anna." They were beginning to argue again. Even in the midst of a gun being pointed right in her face, Anna still felt the need to yell back. As they fell into their usual back and forth, I decided that now was my chance. I slowly reached down into my pocket and slid my phone out onto the couch as they were going back and forth. If I could just get to the emergency call button, I could get the police on the phone and they could track my location, right? I had just gotten the phone out and onto the couch next to me when I noticed something. The battery was dead. I swore under my breath. My only hope of getting me and Anna out of this mess was gone, extinguished before I even had the chance to try. Just as I was trying to think of a plan B, Anna stood up from the couch, looking ready to embrace Dave in a hug. What the hell had I missed? What had they been talking about where now she was ready to give him a hug? Dave's expression of blind fury and hatred began to twist into one of sorrow and regret. He began to cry as Anna inched her way closer to him. "It's all right," she said, in the same tone of voice a mother would use to soothe her sobbing child. "It's all right. Come here." Dave dropped the arm holding the gun down to his side and pulled Anna into a hug with the other arm, the knuckles on his gun hand turning white from how hard he was gripping the weapon. They stood there and embraced like that for a moment, Dave beginning to cry harder and harder as he kept repeating the words, "I'm sorry," again and again. I stood there watching as he drew in a large breath and with a tone of finality uttered, "I'm sorry," one last time, before slowly raising the gun to his own head. "Dave, no!" I screamed, but it was too late. The sound of the gunshot left my ears ringing. I wasn't able to hear the screams of shock and horror that were coming from Anna's mouth. I knelt down next to Dave. Blood was pouring out of the large hole that was left in the side of his head. I began to cry. The police were there in a matter of minutes, taking down my statement as well as Anna's. I still keep in touch with her, and I've since graduated from college and am working in a field that I love. But every now and again, I think back to that time in college and that horrible moment where 3 lives were changed in the blink of an eye.